Found out my name wasn't even mentioned in my guardian's will. Everything went to my cousin. So I quietly stopped paying their rent and weekly grocery runs. A few weeks later, Aunt texted, "The water just got shut off." No hello, no explanation. I just replied, "Not my apartment." I, 32M, thought I knew where I stood in my family until 3 weeks ago when everything I believed about loyalty and love came crashing down. My aunt and uncle raised me from age 8 after my parents died in a car accident. They weren't perfect, but they gave me a roof over my head and food on the table. I called them my guardians because that's what they were legally, though I always hoped they saw me as more than just an obligation. For the past 6 years, I've been covering their rent and buying their groceries every week. It started when Uncle Jim had his heart attack and couldn't work construction anymore. Aunt Linda's part-time job at the grocery store barely covered utilities. I had just gotten my promotion at the engineering firm, so stepping in felt natural. Family takes care of family, right? Every Friday, I'd swing by their apartment with bags of groceries. Every month, I'd transfer $800 for their rent. They never asked directly, but the grateful looks and Aunt Linda's tight hugs told me everything I needed to know. Or so I thought. 3 weeks ago, I was helping Uncle Jim organize his desk when I noticed an envelope from their lawyer's office. The letterhead caught my eye because I recognized the firm. They'd handled my parents' estate years ago. Uncle Jim was in the bathroom, so I glanced at the papers scattered on his desk. That's when I saw it. Their will, updated just 6 months ago. I shouldn't have read it, but something compelled me to scan the document. My name appeared exactly once, in a paragraph stating that I was not entitled to any portion of their estate due to not being a blood relative. Everything was going to my cousin Derek. Derek, who lived 2 states away and visited maybe twice a year. Derek, who never called unless he needed money. Derek, who had openly mocked me at family gatherings for being the charity case they took in. The house they owned but rented out for extra income. Derek's. Uncle Jim's vintage car collection that he'd promised would be mine someday. Derek's. Even Aunt Linda's jewelry, including my mother's ring that she'd worn since the funeral. Derek's. I sat there staring at those papers, feeling something cold settle in my chest. 6 years of rent payments. 6 years of grocery runs. 6 years of believing I was family, not just some burden they'd inherited. Uncle Jim came back from the bathroom and found me holding the will. His face went red, then pale. He started explaining how blood family was different, how they had to think about their real legacy. He said I'd understand when I was older, that I'd always have a place in their hearts even if not in their will. I nodded and smiled and told him I understood completely. And I did understand. I understood that I'd been playing a game where the rules were never explained to me. That night, I went home and canceled the automatic transfer for their rent. I also made a note in my phone to skip the grocery run that Friday. The first week passed quietly. I spent Friday evening at the gym instead of shopping for them. It felt strange, but liberating. The second week, Aunt Linda called to ask if I was okay since I hadn't stopped by. I told her I was fine, just busy with work. She seemed satisfied with that explanation. By the third week, I could tell they were getting nervous. Uncle Jim called twice, asking about random things that were clearly excuses to check on me. I kept my responses brief but friendly. Then came the text that confirmed everything I'd suspected about my place in their lives. Tuesday morning, 7:43 a.m. The water just got shut off. No greeting. No explanation. No acknowledgement that we hadn't spoken properly in weeks. Just a demand disguised as information, expecting me to jump into action like I always had. I stared at that message for a full minute, remembering every grocery bag I'd carried up their stairs, every rent check I'd written, every time I'd rearranged my schedule to help them with something. Then I typed back 4 words that felt like the most honest thing I'd said to them in years. Not my apartment. My phone started ringing within minutes. First Aunt Linda, then Uncle Jim, then both of them on a 3-way call that I let go to voicemail. The messages they left were a mixture of confusion, anger, and barely concealed panic. Aunt Linda's voicemail was particularly revealing. She wanted to know what was wrong with me, why I was acting so strange, and whether I'd forgotten that family helps family. The irony wasn't lost on me. Uncle Jim's message was more direct. He said they needed to talk, that there had been some misunderstanding, and that I needed to remember everything they'd done for me over the years. I deleted both messages without responding. Update 1. The calls and texts escalated over the next few days. Derek even reached out, which was unprecedented. He'd apparently gotten a frantic call from his parents about my sudden rebellion and wanted to know what my problem was. I told Derek exactly what my problem was. I explained that I'd seen the will, that I understood my position in the family hierarchy, and that I was simply adjusting my behavior accordingly. If I wasn't family enough to inherit anything, then I wasn't family enough to pay for everything either. Derek's response was predictably selfish. He accused me of being petty and trying to manipulate his parents. He said the will was just a legal formality and didn't reflect how they really felt about me. When I asked him if he'd be willing to split the inheritance with me, he went quiet and then hung up. Meanwhile, my guardian's situation was deteriorating rapidly. The water had been restored after Aunt Linda borrowed money from a neighbor, but now the electricity was in jeopardy. Their rent was 2 weeks overdue, and their landlord was starting to make threatening calls. Uncle Jim showed up at my apartment on Thursday evening. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, with deep circles under his eyes and a defeated slump to his shoulders. He asked if we could talk, and I let him in. He sat on my couch and tried to explain their reasoning about the will. He said they'd always planned to leave me something, but their lawyer had advised them that keeping inheritance within blood family was simpler legally. He promised they were going to set up a separate fund for me, something outside the will. I listened to his explanation and then asked him a simple question. If they died tomorrow, what would I actually receive? He couldn't answer because we both knew the truth. There was no separate fund. There were no plans to take care of me. There was just the will that explicitly excluded me and a lot of promises that existed only in conversation. I told Uncle Jim that I appreciated everything they'd done for me as a child, but that our relationship as adults had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. I'd been acting like family while they'd been treating me like a grateful dependent. He left that night looking broken, but I felt clearer than I had in weeks. Update 2. The weekend brought a new development. Aunt Linda called me crying, saying they were going to be evicted if they couldn't pay rent by Monday. She begged me to help them one more time, promising that things would be different going forward. I asked her specifically what would be different. Would I be included in the will? Would they start treating me like family instead of like hired help? Would Derek be expected to contribute to their care? She couldn't give me concrete answers to any of those questions. Instead, she fell back on emotional manipulation, talking about how much they loved me and how they'd raised me when no one else would. That's when something inside me snapped. I reminded her that they hadn't raised me out of love. They'd raised me because they were legally obligated to do so as my appointed guardians. They'd received Social Security survivor benefits for me until I turned 18, plus assistance from the state. Raising me hadn't been charity. It had been their responsibility. The conversation ended with Aunt Linda accusing me of being heartless and ungrateful. She said I was abandoning them in their time of need, just like my parents had abandoned me. That last comment crossed a line I didn't even know existed. I hung up and blocked both their numbers. Update 3. Monday came and went. I assumed they'd found a way to handle the rent, either through Derek or by borrowing from other relatives. I was wrong. Tuesday evening, my neighbor knocked on my door. She'd seen an older woman sitting in the hallway outside my apartment for the past 2 hours. It was Aunt Linda, looking disheveled and holding a small suitcase. She'd been evicted that morning. Uncle Jim was staying with his brother across town, but apparently there wasn't room for both of them. She'd come to my apartment expecting me to take her in. I opened my door and looked at this woman who'd helped raise me, who'd taught me to drive, who'd attended my college graduation. I felt a mixture of sadness and anger that I couldn't untangle. She started talking immediately, explaining how the eviction had happened so fast, how they'd tried to work something out with the landlord, how Derek was looking into helping them but couldn't do anything immediately. I let her finish, then asked her the same question I'd asked Uncle Jim. If they died tomorrow, what would I inherit? She gave me the same non-answer he had, full of vague promises and emotional appeals. I told Aunt Linda that I'd help her find a shelter for the night and that I'd pay for a week at a budget motel while she figured out her next steps. But I wouldn't be resuming my role as their financial support system. She called me selfish and cruel. She said I was punishing them for a piece of paper that didn't mean anything. She said family was about more than money and inheritance. I agreed with her completely. Family was about more than money. It was about respect, inclusion, and genuine care. It was about not taking someone for granted while simultaneously excluding them from your future plans. I drove her to a motel that night and paid for a week's stay. I also gave her $200 for food and necessities. But I made it clear that this was a one-time gesture, not a resumption of our previous arrangement. As I was leaving, she asked me what it would take for things to go back to normal between us. I told her the truth. I didn't want things to go back to normal. Normal had been me giving everything while receiving nothing but the privilege of being needed. Normal had been me believing I was family while being treated like a convenient outsider. I said that if they wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would have to be built on honesty and mutual respect. That meant acknowledging what our relationship had really been, making concrete changes to how they treated me, and accepting that I wouldn't be their financial safety net anymore. She said I was asking too much, that I was being unreasonable. I said that was fine. We could agree to disagree. I haven't heard from any of them since then. Derek apparently stepped up enough to help them find a small apartment, though I heard through mutual family friends that he's not happy about the ongoing financial responsibility. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh. Then I remember that text message. The water just got shut off, and how it perfectly summarized 24 years of being taken for granted. I don't regret my decision. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not sending money to people who see me as a convenient resource rather than family. I'm not spending my weekends shopping for people who've explicitly excluded me from their future. I'm finally free to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation and guilt. And that freedom, it turns out, is worth more than any inheritance I was never going to receive anyway.